This old hope chest is useless storage, Dorothy. Karen's voice cut through my living room like a blade, sharp and deliberate. Nobody keeps these ancient cedar boxes anymore. I sat beside my chest organizing baby blankets, each one carefully folded and preserved. The same chest my mother had given me when I turned 16, carved with roses and filled with dreams for my future family. Karen lifted the lid dismissively, her manicured fingers examining the contents like a prosecutor building a case. Look at this yellowed fabric, these moth holes. This belongs in a dumpster, not displayed like some family treasure. My heart clenched. That chest holds everything I saved for my children and grandchildren, I said quietly, continuing to fold a tiny yellow sweater I'd knitted for my first grandchild. Every piece tells a story of hope. Hope for what? Karen snapped, her voice growing louder. Your kids are grown. Your grandkids have everything they need. This is just hoarding disguised as sentiment. My son Robert sat at the dining table reading his newspaper, the same table where we'd celebrated every family milestone. He said nothing to defend the chest his grandmother had filled with love, nothing to protect the memories I'd carefully preserved for decades. Karen rifled through the contents like a critic at an estate sale. These handmade quilts are falling apart. Nobody dresses children in this old-fashioned embroidered stuff anymore. It's all so outdated. Old-fashioned embroidered stuff that I'd stitched during long pregnancy nights when hope for healthy babies filled my heart and every tiny cross-stitch represented a prayer for my unborn children. Robert finally looked up from his paper, but not in my defense. Maybe Mom could donate some of this. Keep just a few special pieces. Clear out the rest. Robert, look at this mess, Karen said, loud enough to ensure I heard every word. Her voice carried that particular tone she used when she wanted to sound reasonable while being cruel. This is exactly why older people shouldn't be in charge of their own homes anymore. They can't make rational decisions about what to keep and what to throw away. This is the kind of clutter people keep before they lose the ability to think clearly. The room went dead silent. Even Robert looked uncomfortable, finally realizing how harsh his wife sounded. 56 years of collected treasure, each piece chosen with love and preserved with care, reduced to evidence of my supposed mental incompetence. But Karen had no idea what she was really looking at. What happened next would change everything she thought she knew about our family. If you've ever felt overlooked in your own home, you'll understand why this moment stayed with me. That evening, after they left, I sat alone with my chest in the quiet living room. The late afternoon sun streamed through my lace curtain, the same curtains I'd sewn 40 years ago when Robert was just a boy playing in this very room. I traced my fingers along the chest's carved roses, remembering the day my mother presented it to me. Every young woman needs a hope chest, she'd said, her eyes twinkling with secrets I was too young to understand, to collect dreams for the family she'll build. For 56 years, this chest had been my companion through every season of life. I'd filled it during my engagement to Harold, adding linens and baby clothes with each passing month. After our wedding, I'd continued collecting treasures for the children I dreamed of having. When Robert was born, I'd wrapped him in the first blanket from this chest. When his sister Sarah arrived 2 years later, she too was welcomed home in handmade clothes I'd stored with such care. Every birthday, every Christmas, every milestone had been touched by something from this collection. Karen grew up in a small apartment with no heirlooms, no keepsakes, nothing that felt permanent. Maybe that's why she never understood why I held on to mine, but understanding and cruelty were different things. I opened the chest and breathed in the familiar scent of cedar and lavender. Each item held a memory. The christening gown I'd sewn for both my children, the quilts I'd pieced together during long winter evenings, the tiny booties I'd knitted while waiting for grandchildren to be born. But something felt different. Karen's words echoed in my mind, rational decision, and lose the ability to think clearly, as if my age had somehow made me incapable of knowing what mattered. I traced my fingers along the chest's edges, remembering my mother's final words about it. Some gifts protect more than they store, Dorothy. Remember that. At the time, I thought she meant protection from moths and time. Now I wondered if she meant something else entirely. The next morning, Karen returned with measuring tape and storage catalogs, her mission clear from the moment she walked through my door without knocking. I've been thinking about your space issues, she announced, spreading glossy brochures across my coffee table. That chest is wasting prime real estate. We could fit a beautiful modern entertainment center right there. I watched her measure around the chest, her eyes calculating square footage and storage potential. My mother chose this spot specifically, I said carefully. Your mother's been gone 15 years, Dorothy. It's time to make decisions based on your current needs, not sentimental attachments to the past. Current need. As if hope had an expiration date, as if the dreams I'd carefully tended for decades had somehow become irrelevant because I'd grown older. I actually talked to Robert last night, she continued, not meeting my. He agrees it's time to be practical about your collections. He's worried about you living alone with so much stuff. My son had been discussing my belongings behind my back, making decisions about my life without including me in the conversation. Karen opened her catalog to a page she'd bookmarked. Look at these beautiful storage solutions. Clean lines, no dust collectors, everything hidden away neatly. Much more appropriate for someone your age. Everything hidden away, like my mother's real gifts to me, like the memories that gave meaning to my daily life. These modern systems are so much easier to maintain, she continued. No more bending over low chests, no more sorting through old fabric that probably attracts insects. But I'd never had problems with insects. I'd never found the chest difficult to manage. These weren't solutions to actual problems. They were solutions to Karen's discomfort with my choices. That's when I realized Karen wasn't just organizing my space. She was erasing my history, piece by piece. But she had no idea what she was really trying to erase. Karen's visits became daily events, each one bringing new urgency about the chest situation. She'd arrive with different reasons why it needed to go, as if she'd been researching arguments online. Dorothy, I've been learning about fire safety for seniors, she announced Monday morning, armed with printed articles. Cedar chests are actually dangerous. One spark and all that stored fabric goes up in flames. Tuesday brought a new concern. I spoke with my friend who's an interior designer. She says hope chests went out of style decades ago. They make homes look dated, like museums. Wednesday, Robert mentioned you've been having back pain. Bending over that low chest can't be good for your spine at your age. Robert meant my son was sharing my medical information with his wife, giving her ammunition for her campaign. Maybe you're right about the back pain, I said Thursday, watching Karen's face carefully. But I'd need help moving it. It's heavier than it looks. Her eyes lit up with sudden interest. Heavy? What makes it so heavy? It's just wood and fabric, right? Well, the wood is thick cedar, I said slowly, testing her reaction. And the bottom has extra supports. My mother insisted on quality construction back then. Extra supports? Karen leaned forward, suddenly focused. What kind of supports? Like additional beams or something? I pretended to consider. I'm not sure exactly. I never paid much attention to the construction details when I was younger. Something shifted in Karen's expression. She seemed more interested in the chest's structure than its content, more curious about its weight than its sentimental value. That evening, I found her in my living room with a flashlight, examining the chest's underside like a detective searching for clues. Karen, what are you doing? She straightened quickly, flustered and caught in the act. Oh, I was just checking for termite damage. You know, making sure it's structurally sound before we move it. Termite damage, with a flashlight, in the dark, on a piece of furniture that had been in my home for decades without any pest problem. But what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my daughter-in-law. I really think we should get this appraised, she continued, her voice too casual, too calculated, just to know its actual value, for insurance purposes, of course. Insurance purposes, or resale purposes. In that moment, I understood Karen wasn't afraid of clutter. She was afraid of what she didn't control. Friday brought a surprise I hadn't expected. Karen arrived with Robert and a man I'd never seen before. Someone whose professional appearance and measuring tools immediately put me on guard. Mom, this is Jim, Robert explained, looking slightly uncomfortable. He's an antique appraiser. Karen thought it would be good to know what your furniture is worth. Karen's smile was too bright, too eager. Just for peace of mind, Dorothy. We want to make sure you're properly insured in case anything happens to your beautiful pieces. Jim examined my chest with the eye of someone who'd spent years evaluating antiques. Beautiful cedar construction, he murmured, running his hands along the joints. Probably 1940s craftsmanship. These old hope chests can be quite valuable, especially with original hardware. He tapped various sections, listening to the sound the wood made. The weight suggests solid wood throughout. No particle board shortcuts like you see in modern furniture. What makes it so heavy? Karen asked, her voice carefully casual, though I could see the tension in her posture. Jim continued his examination, checking hinges and examining the carving details. Extra thick base for one thing. Sometimes these old craftsmen added false bottoms for additional storage, very common in Depression-era pieces when people needed to hide valuables. False bottoms. Karen's eyes met mine for a split second, and I saw something flash across her face. Excitement, greed, or maybe just curiosity. But she had no idea what she'd just stumbled onto. False bottoms? Robert asked, suddenly interested. You mean like secret compartments? Exactly. Jim nodded. Families would hide important documents, jewelry, even money. The chest would look perfectly normal but hold much more than clothes and linen. It was a way to protect valuables during uncertain times. After they left, Karen lingered at my door, her earlier urgency replaced by something more calculating. Dorothy, she said slowly, did your mother ever mention anything about special features in the chest? Anything unusual about its construction? I kept my expression neutral, innocent. Special features? Like what? Well, Jim said there might be hidden storage compartments. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the bottom? Any panels that seemed different? I've never really looked closely. I lied smoothly. Why do you ask? Karen's frustration was barely controlled now. Well, maybe we should check. For historical interest, of course. It might be worth documenting for the family. Historical interest. Of course. That night, alone with my chest, I thought about my mother's final words. Some gifts protect more than they store, Dorothy. For the first time in 56 years, I really examined the bottom of my chest with adult eyes and careful attention. There, barely visible unless you knew exactly what to look for, were the tiny hinges my mother had shown me once, long ago. I waited until I was certain I wouldn't be disturbed. Karen had established such a predictable pattern of visits that I knew exactly when I'd have privacy to explore what my mother had really left me. My hands trembled as I pressed the hidden latches my mother had shown me decades ago, mechanisms I'd forgotten until Jim's words brought the memory flooding back. The false bottom slid away with the whisper of well-oiled wood. What I found inside changed everything I thought I knew about my family. Documents, stacks of them, carefully preserved in waterproof wrapping. Bank statements showing accounts I'd never known existed. Property deeds to land in 3 different states. Investment certificates that had been quietly growing for decades. My mother hadn't just been a careful saver. She'd been building wealth methodically, systematically, and she'd hidden it all beneath my baby blankets and wedding linen. Stock portfolios worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Real estate holdings that had appreciated far beyond their original value. Life insurance policies that had matured into substantial sums. And a letter, written in my mother's careful handwriting, explaining everything. My dearest Dorothy, it began, if you're reading this, it means you've finally discovered what your hope chest really holds. I've spent 50 years building security for our family, hiding it where only a woman who truly valued the chest would think to. The letter went on to explain her investment strategy, her real estate purchases, her careful planning for a future she wouldn't live to see. Every deposit, every purchase, every decision had been documented and preserved for the woman who would inherit not just furniture, but financial freedom. As I read, I realized my mother had been far smarter than anyone had given her credit for. She'd used her hope chest as the perfect safe, protected by sentiment, hidden in plain sight, overlooked by anyone who couldn't understand its true value. Karen's eager face flashed through my mind. She'd sensed something valuable but had no idea how valuable. She'd been circling like a predator, looking for weakness, hoping to profit from what she saw as an old woman's inability to make rational decisions, but she had no idea what she was really hunting. I didn't tell anyone about my discovery. Instead, I watched and waited as Karen's pressure campaign intensified. Dorothy, I've scheduled movers for this weekend, she announced the following Tuesday, not bothering with pleasantries. It's time to get that chest out of here and make some real changes to your living situation. Movers? My heart raced, but I kept my voice steady. I haven't agreed to sell anything. Robert thinks it's best, she said firmly. We found a lovely antique dealer who will give you a fair price. You can use the money for your living expenses. They were planning to sell my chest without my explicit permission, treating me like an incompetent child who couldn't manage her own affairs. I need more time to go through everything inside, I said carefully, gauging her reaction. Karen's eyes narrowed with impatience. What's there to go through? It's just old linens and baby clothes that nobody uses anymore. Still, I'd like to sort through my mother's things properly. Some of them might have sentimental value. Your mother's been dead for 15 years, Dorothy. How much more time do you need to make peace with letting go? The cruelty in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't about helping me, and if it ever had been. That evening, Robert called with the same rehearsed argument. Mom, Karen's right about the chest. It's just taking up space you could use for more practical purposes. The money from selling it could help with your expenses. My expenses? I almost laughed, thinking about the investment accounts that had been quietly growing beneath his childhood blanket. What if I'm not ready to sell it? I asked, testing his resolve. Mom, you're 72 years old. You need to start making practical decisions about your possessions before you can't make them at all. Practical decision about the chest that contained more wealth than Robert would earn in the next 5 years. I'll think about it, I promised, but I'd already made my decision. Tomorrow, I would show them exactly what they were so eager to sell. And from that moment, I stopped seeing Karen as just my difficult daughter-in-law and started seeing her as a threat to my mother's carefully built legacy. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, matching my mood as I prepared for what felt like a final confrontation. I'd spent the week thinking about my mother's letter, about the sacrifices she'd made to build security for future generations, about the trust she'd placed in me to protect what she'd created. Karen arrived with the movers exactly on schedule, her confidence evident in every gesture. Dorothy, we're here to help you with the chest, she announced without bothering to knock, leading 3 men into my living room like a general commanding troops. I know change is hard, but you'll feel so much better once we clear out this old furniture and make some space. Actually, I said, standing beside my open chest with my hands resting protectively on its rim, I think you should see something first. Karen froze, something in my tone catching her attention. The way I was standing, the quiet authority in my voice, something fundamental had shifted. What? She asked, but her confident facade was already beginning to crack. I've been going through my mother's things more carefully, I said calmly, and I discovered that this chest holds more than baby clothes and linen. The movers stood awkwardly near the door, clearly sensing tension they hadn't expected. I pressed the hidden latches with steady fingers. The false bottom slid away with the whisper of well-oiled mechanism. The room went dead silent. Even the movers stopped breathing. Karen's face went white as paper. Inside the secret compartment lay stacks of documents that would change everything about how my family saw me, saw my mother, and saw the chest they'd been so eager to discard. Useless storage, I said quietly, lifting out the first bank statement with hands that no longer trembled. That's been protecting our family's wealth for 50 years? Bank statements showing accounts worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, property deeds to land that had appreciated beyond anyone's imagination, investment certificate that had been quietly growing for decades while everyone assumed my mother had been just another elderly woman without significant assets. One account alone held more money than Robert had earned in the last 5 years. Karen's hand went to her throat as if she couldn't breathe. She stepped backward, bumping into the doorframe, her eyes fixed on the documents that transformed everything she thought she knew about our family's financial situation. That's impossible, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I held up a property deed with my mother's name clearly visible. 40 acres in Tennessee. Been in our family since 1943, with mineral rights included. And this one, 60 acres in Kentucky. Oil rights and water access. The documents kept coming, each one more substantial than the last. Stock certificates from companies that had multiplied in value. Life insurance policies that had matured into small fortunes. Bank accounts in 3 different states. All carefully managed and documented. Robert appeared in the doorway, drawn by the unnatural silence. Mom? What's going on? Karen looks like she's seen a ghost. She's just learning what she almost convinced you to sell for a few $100s, I said, spreading documents across my coffee table like playing cards in a winning hand. Robert's mouth fell open as his eyes took in the numbers, the official letterhead, the accumulated wealth that had been hidden beneath his childhood memories. Mom, is this all real? Every penny documented and verified, I replied. Your grandmother was a very careful woman, much more careful than anyone gave her credit for. Karen finally found her voice, but it came out as barely more than a croak. You knew about this the whole time? I discovered it this week, I said honestly, when you were so eager to have the chest appraised, when you started examining it with flashlights and asking about hidden compartment. She slumped against the wall, her hands shaking. The color had completely drained from her face. I almost, she whispered, but couldn't finish the sentence. The movers stood frozen in my doorway, clearly uncomfortable witnesses to a family drama they hadn't anticipated. I think we won't be needing your services today, I told them gently. After they left, my living room was completely silent except for Karen's shallow breathing and Robert's stunned whispers as he examined document after document. Some discoveries change everything in an instant. This was one of them. In the days that followed, everything in our family dynamic shifted like tectonic plates finding a new arrangement. Karen couldn't look me in the eye for days. When she finally returned to my house, she was a completely different person, subdued, respectful, almost fearful of the woman she'd so recently dismissed as incompetent. But then something strange happened. Karen started asking different questions. She apologized, truly apologized, for the first time since I'd known her. Dorothy, I'm so sorry. I honestly thought you were just holding on to clutter that had no real value. I thought I was helping you make practical decisions. Some clutter protects more than we realize, I replied gently, allowing her the dignity of a graceful retreat from her earlier cruelty. Robert helped me organize the documents properly, his respect for his grandmother's wisdom evident in every careful movement. I can't believe she planned all this and never said a word. All those years we thought she was just ordinary. Your grandmother knew that women's security often depends on what others don't see, I explained. She understood that visible wealth attracts the wrong kind of attention, especially from people who might try to take advantage of elderly women. Karen began visiting for different reasons, to learn, not to change. She brought tea and asked questions about my mother's life, my marriage, the financial decisions that had led to this moment of revelation. How did she know to invest in these companies? Karen asked one afternoon, studying the stock certificates with newfound respect. She read everything, I said, remembering my mother's habit of studying financial newspapers like other women read recipes. She understood that small, consistent investments would grow over time if you chose the right companies and had the patience to wait. And you never knew? Karen pressed. I knew she was careful with money. I didn't know she was brilliant with it. Christmas that year felt like a celebration of family, not just obligation. The chest remained in its place of honor, no longer hiding secrets, but protecting them openly for future generations to discover and appreciate. Karen brought me a beautiful cedar polish for the wood, for keeping it beautiful for your grandchildren to inherit someday. Robert's gift was a fireproof safe, for backup copies of all the important documents, while keeping the originals in their special place. But the most meaningful gift was the change in how my family saw me. No longer the sentimental old woman clinging to worthless clutter, but the guardian of a legacy that had taken 3 generations to build. If this story touched something familiar, may your next chapter be softer than the last. Sometimes what others call useless holds the most value. Sometimes what looks like hoarding is actually hope made tangible. And sometimes the most powerful protection comes from what people choose not to see. Your treasures matter. Your instincts matter. And sometimes a chest doesn't just hold fabric, it holds a family's entire future, protected by women who understood that love takes many forms, including preparation for times when hope must sustain generations yet to come.